Hello, I'm delighted to welcome you to another episode of It's Not That Simple from the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation. And as you know, if you watch this series, we're really trying to break down some of the most important topics in economics and politics of our contemporary society. Now, today is quite a big one because we're going to be discussing the topic of democracy. What's happening with democracy? Is it doomed? Is it alive? Can we be confident about a system that has been under threat in various parts of the world? And let's be honest, we've even seen recently in the United States that's supposed to be one of the beacons of democracy, election results being contested, and then of course the insurrection at the Capitol. So really pertinent topic to discuss it right now, and we're really honored to have an opportunity to discuss it with really a global expert on this matter in this landscape, who is Daniel Ziblatt. Daniel is a Eaton Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard University. He's an American political scientist with a research focus on comparative politics, democracy and democratization. He also does some work with the Social Science Center in Berlin. Co-author of a very well-known and acclaimed book, How Democracies Die, that spent several weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list back in 2018. Daniel, I could keep going with your CV because it's quite an impressive one, but I think the key message is you're an expert in this topic, and we're really glad that we have you here to discuss it. So I think to kick this conversation off, I will ask you to tell us how democracies die.
Well, first, just a word of thanks for the invitation to be with you and to be talking about this important topic. One of the points of that book that we wrote with that title is that democracies don't die like they used to. During the Cold War, the way that democracies usually died was through military coups. 3/4 of democratic breakdowns happened at the hands of generals, men with guns, tanks in the streets. These were very vivid images. But since the end of the Cold War, it's much more, sometimes you still get military coups, but it's much more common now for democracies to die at the ballot box. So politicians get elected through democratic channels, come to office, and then chip away at democratic institutions once in power. And so what makes this so tricky, of course, is that it looks from the outside, from a distance perhaps, that the politicians who've been elected are acting in a democratic fashion. After all, they've been elected, they have a mandate, they may even have majority support, although usually not. They have, lots of support. And so it's hard for citizens and observers to kind of identify precisely what's happening. But, as one stands by and waits, democracy gets chipped away at and weakened. And so, actually, kind of striking poll that I saw, long into Hugo Chavez's presidency, after he was in power, most Venezuelans, according to polls, thought they still lived in a democracy. So you really only discover it when it's too late. And so that's one of the purposes of writing the book, is to identify kind of the warning signs to recognize when a democracy is at threat.
Okay, so the name of this series is It's Not That Simple. So I wanted you to tell us why protecting democracies is not that simple.
Yes, so the first problem is exactly the one that I just mentioned, which is that those who are assaulting democracy claim to be acting on behalf of democracy. To take a very live example, in Israel today, Prime Minister Netanyahu is attempting to weaken the judiciary, and his government claims he's acting on behalf of the majority who elected him and his government, and that courts or judges are unelected, and that they're blocking the will of the majority. So this sounds like a pretty good argument, right? And so, I actually think, though, that this is also an assault on the checks and balances that are necessary for any democracy. So, how one decides what is a legitimate reform to be democratic, that its advocates say is democratic, versus really an assault on democracy, it is not that simple, as you say. And so I think really digging into that's really important.
There's so many aspects of this topic that I hope to get into over the next 20 minutes or so, but I am genuinely, as a human being, worried about the future of democracy, not only because politicians are doing what you said very well, which is claiming they're acting on in the interests of democracy, but then as soon as they're in power, changing their rhetoric and their actions right away. But also because I feel people are increasingly bombarded with too much information that confuses their ability, because a lot of it is not true, to make decisions when they go to the polls and make a democracy sustainable. How do you look at the current landscape in the Western world and give us some kind of hope that the democracy that we grew up with works? Because yes, people are informed to make the right decisions, and yes, then the politicians respect those decisions and move along with them.
Yeah, so I think it's important to step back and have a broader historical sweep, because one of the things that we often forget, because there's so many worrying signs currently in so many important democracies, the United States, Israel, India, Turkey, I don't even know if we call that still a democracy, but in any case, places where democracy seems to be challenged. And so we see these crises and rightfully are concerned and want to defend democracy. But something that we tend to forget is in the global sweep in the grand historical sweep of the last several centuries, there's rarely been fewer democracies on the planet than there are today. So beginning in 1990, there was this real spike in the number of new democracies after the end of the Cold War. And this grew really consistently in a stable fashion until about 2010. And so the various democratic indices, varieties of democracies, an organization based out of Sweden, Freedom House is based out of the United States, who code the number of democracies in the world, show that beginning in around 2010, that the growth rate of the number of new democracies sort of flatlined. And that kind of actually makes sense, because once a lot of democracies are there, it's hard for new democracies to make headway in really difficult circumstances. But really what became worrying is around 2012, 2015, the number of democracies really began to decline, and the number of autocracies began to increase. But still, there's more democracies in the world today than there were in 1990. So, in some sense, we're in a better situation than we were in 1990. So that's one important fact to keep in mind. Now, one way that other people have measured this is, rather than looking at the number of democracies in the world, the percentage of the population who live in democracies, and the organization Varieties of Democracy emphasizes that statistic. And according to that, because there are a lot of large countries like India, like Brazil, like the United States that have had trouble, this organization tends to point out, the number of citizens living in countries that are democracies or that are in democracies facing challenges is increasing. So, if we measure it as the total population, things look more worrying. If we measure it as the number of countries in the world, things are actually not as bad as sometimes the hyperventilation would lead us to believe. And so, again, I don't want to de-emphasize the importance of the challenges that West European democracies face, that the United States faces, that lots of other, India, Brazil, other countries have faced over the last several years. But we should also remember, on the other hand, there's countries like Taiwan where democracy is working pretty well, South Korea, places that democratized in the last 20, 30 years, and democracy continues to thrive. So to come directly to your question very quickly is just to say that, what's the sign that democracy works well? We have to think of what the alternatives are. And it seems to me, as challenged as democracy looks, when we compare democracies to the alternatives, there's a famous line from Winston Churchill along these lines that, this is the worst system except for all the others. And I think in fact, what we're witnessing in many ways, possibly when we see the rise of radical right movements or groups that challenge democracy, is we're seeing a process of self-correction underway. And democracies are very transparent, so we see all the messiness. Authoritarian systems, you don't see any of the messiness. So you don't understand, we don't see sort of as directly how weak and fragile they actually may be.
Obviously, when you look at examples of everything that can go wrong when a democracy doesn't work, I mean, an example we have of that nowadays is obviously Russia and the war in Ukraine. I still can't believe that in 2023, some of these leaders are allowed to rise to power and then stay there permanently. But I'm not going to get into that. What I am going to get into is, what effect do you think the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, has had as a message that democracies work, that they're important, that they're under threat?
Well, I think the first thing it shows is the dangers of arbitrary rule. When you have political leaders, getting to the first part of your question there, when you have political leaders, and the virtue of democracy is that leaders are constrained. That's one of the virtues of democracy, and it's hard for leaders to carry out arbitrary rule. That is, following whatever whim they want in an unaccountable fashion. And when they, commit major errors, are they punished or not? By citizens. And in a democracy, politicians, if they commit a major error, usually are held to account in the next election. And so they operate with that fear and shadow hanging over them, which is a powerful constraint on their actions. I think the war in Ukraine showed, which was a major blunder by all accounts on the part of Vladimir Putin. And he's still in power and very powerful, and so that there's an unaccountability which leads to arbitrary rule. And then the dangers of this is that the direct threats this represents to human life, flows from unconstrained leadership. He famously wrote this essay, I guess a few years ago, in which he laid out his vision. And everybody says, well, if you want to know what he's doing, you have to read this essay that he wrote. And, the idea that a political leader can kind of write a manifesto and then get his entire country to rally around it and implement it is remarkable. I write essays all the time, and, I can hardly get my students to read them. So, I think that this shows you the kind of the dangers of unconstrained power. So, and the degree to which democracies have responded to this, and the West has responded to this in a pretty coherent, cohesive fashion, I think speaks to the strengths and the alliances and the shared values of democracies. And of course, the question, and I think in many ways Putin underestimated the strength and resilience of democracies. Going forward, the question is how long can this coherence of a common front be sustained? That's a different question. But I think so far the strength of democracy has been on full display.
So two traditional examples of democracy, I think we could say, in this conversation are the United States and Brazil, and obviously both of those were challenged by Donald Trump and Bolsonaro. The fact that they didn't stay in power, that they lost elections, was that a good sign for democracy? Was that a sign that democracy still can work and will work in these countries? And what impact did those insurrections have, both at the Capitol and in Brasilia, as we look forward to an election in the States in quite a short period of time and a new government in Brazil?
Yeah, I guess there's good news and bad news. The good news is that the elections did work. There was a change in leadership. There was a mass mobilization of citizens to vote across the political spectrum in both places, and a kind of broad coalition of voters. Many Republicans voted for Joe Biden, and there's this kind of faction of never Trump Republicans who rallied and recognized the threat that Donald Trump represented, and so the small d democratic forces won the day in both countries. That's the good news. And so a change of leadership was possible in that sense. The electoral institutions actually continue to work. But the point would be just barely, because part of making a democracy work is that the losers accept the results. That's what democracy in effect is a system in which losers give up power. And that barely happened, and happened only with great resistance. And, I think what's worrying about the event, well, two things. One, the events themselves are worrying, but they also are worrying in their consequence, because the question becomes like, how do historians and journalists and citizens interpret the events? And what's happening in the United States is a very active effort to recast those events as not so bad. And so there's allies of Trump and his kind of plans to run again in 2024 to say, either these people assaulting the Congress weren't really that dangerous, or they were actually heroes. And this kind of active effort to rewrite the history, I think, means that you have less consensus in the world, in politics, about what is beyond the pale, what's unacceptable. And when you don't have that kind of consensus, then it makes it much easier for this kind of thing to happen again. And there's evidence of this happening throughout history. In France in the 1930s, there was an assault on the French Parliament, an effort to overthrow a prime minister, similar kind of thing. And the history that emerged out of that, immediately the right tried to say these guys were heroes, and this led eventually, I would say, to the establishment, to the kind of people who supported the Vichy government in France in 1940. So, once you create these constituencies of people who kind of believe that actually this was a great event and a great heroic moment, this can be very dangerous. And so it's really important that the history be written accurately. And I think that's, people have tried to do this.
That flows very nicely into my next question when you talk about rewriting history, because nowadays in a digital world, it's so easy to get facts and propaganda confused. And what is the role of technology, of social media, of all the regulation around that in protecting democracy as well, so we all have access to the same facts, so we can make decisions based on facts and not on hyperbole or on algorithms or on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that it's important to remember that, as important as all that stuff is, and I'll say a little bit about that, you did have a Spanish Civil War before Twitter, so these democracies can get into trouble even without social media. And there's deep social divisions that often drive, that are the kind of key drivers behind these moments of democratic crisis. But that said, you're absolutely right that that technological developments have exacerbated these divisions and have made them kind of more active and more impactful. So as a result of that, there's a kind of phenomena of, people describe as echo chambers, where you only listen to your own news universe. And there's good social scientific evidence saying that if you only listen to right-wing media and you're on the right, then you'll be pushed further to the right. If you're only on the left and you only listen to left-wing media, you're pushed further to the left. That seems to really be an actual effect. And then you reproduce that at a mass level across society, and this increases polarization. People begin to view each other not as much as common citizens, but as enemies, and the increased fear that the other side, if they come to power, are increasingly dangerous. And when both sides regard the other side as such a danger that you're willing to go to extreme measures to prevent them from getting into power, then you have a democracy that's deconsolidating. And so I think in this way, social media and various technological developments really matter a great deal. And so the question and the challenge, I think, for social institutions, political leaders, media, major news networks, establishment newspapers, and so on, is to try to create a common arena, common public sphere where there are a shared set of facts. It's very difficult, of course, because the kind of financial motives, I think, often are, I've spoken to journalists and to people who run news networks who will say, we run a story with a particular headline and we look at the results and the traffic that comes to our station. And, there's really, even though I know it's not such a great thing to do it, it's pretty tempting to put kind of more inflammatory stuff and highlight certain news stories. And so there's a certain ethical obligation, I think, of journalists, for instance, as they're professionals, abide by our professional ethos to really try to counteract that. It's difficult, though. There's no question about that.
Well, I can tell you, I know of news desks of digital platforms that are constantly changing headlines throughout the day according to the traffic that particular stories are getting, in order to get more engagement from whoever is on the site at that particular time. So definitely, I think journalism as a whole, and editors specifically, need to have a big responsibility and accountability around focusing on facts and not, again, on sensationalism. I did want to touch on Portugal a little bit, because we have practically 5 decades of democracy, but for the first time, a far-right party has representation in Parliament. And in your opinion, what is the major cause for the rise of extremism or far-right parties, and what is the role of kind of the woke movement in precipitating it, or certainly driving it as well?
Yeah, well, so Portugal in many ways was kind of the last beacon of a country within Europe without a significant far-right movement. And so I think a lot of people continue to look to Portugal. And, it's still pretty small in the last elections, a pretty small share of the vote, but I know in polls it's increasingly popular. What's pretty clear, I think, is there's around 20 to 25% of electorates in all major democracies, I would say, West European, North America in particular, that find the kinds of messages that the far-right, populist far-right offers to be very appealing. It's the sort of core of Trump support is about 30% of the electorate, 20, even less perhaps. The core, the upper limit of the AfD, let's say in Germany, is sometimes estimated to be about that amount. And so, I would guess that in Portugal, maybe, there is that potential to reach those levels. The question is, and, that number is not set though, it's not fixed in stone. It's, there's a certain segment of the electorate that finds that, and hopefully over time that percentage of the electorate, becomes less, but there is that potential there. And I think what activates this number to increase over time are things like economic crises, immigration crises, kind of major demographic shifts in populations. But I think really a major role is played by establishment political parties and how they respond to these kind of challenges. And if there's a way in which mainstream political parties respond to these threats by kind of parroting a lot of the rhetoric, this in a sort of paradoxical way, rather than absorbing the voters, legitimates that view. And voters then say, well, there's a mainstream party saying this stuff, and then there's the real deal that's saying this stuff. I'm going to vote for the real deal. So I think there's a danger of mainstream parties trying to act too populist in a sense. To try to appeal to these voters, and they have to come up with real solutions to real problems. Now, in terms of wokeness, I think this is part of the rhetoric of the right around the advanced democracies, is to say that our things have changed dramatically in the way cultural changes have taken place, and there's a kind of backlash against that. And I think in some sense there is the people are responding to something real. But, I also sense that this is exaggerated in terms of its importance. It's a very self-conscious strategy of the right to highlight these issues and to take very minor instances, small portions of national electorates, small but important, but nonetheless small, numerically speaking, are, affected directly by transgender issues, for instance. But this is it's obviously an important issue. But on the other hand, in the national scope of things, I think this takes on an exaggerated importance because the right wants to take advantage of this issue to mobilize voters. So I think in some sense we should be wary of attributing too much to this kind of woke kind of politics. And really what I think mainstream parties should try to do is to solve the real problems that really concern most people in their daily lives, which are often material, education. People want their kids to go to good schools. They want their streets to be safe. They want their kids to be able to play in the park on Sunday and these kinds of things. And those are the kinds of issues that motivate really most voters.
Okay, so I've got 3 more questions before you get to the quick fire. And I'm going to try to run through these in our time slot. So first question to you is, we've talked about the threat of politicians rising to power and then trying to change the system of government to benefit their own purposes. What kind of checks and balances, in your opinion, should governments have generally to make sure that politicians are respecting the Constitution and the regulation that is there in a specific country?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because I kind of left the issue hanging, I think, with your first question when I mentioned the example of Israel, which is, under what conditions is an assault an assault? Under what conditions is it just trying to reform a democracy? I think in order to answer that, we really need to have a pretty clear idea of what democracy is. And, a very simple way of thinking about democracy, it contains multiple elements, but really is to think that there's sort of 3 core pillars. So this is maybe not so simple, but 3 core pillars. One, participation. That is, the more that voters participate in politics, the more impact they have, the better, more democratic. Competition. That is, the more contested races are, the more genuine the competition between political parties, the more democratic a system is. And the third pillar is civil liberties. The rights of individuals need to be protected. And so any institutional reforms that helps those 3 things is democratic. Any institutional reform that hurts any of those three things is anti-democratic. So in order to understand, let's say there's an assault on the judiciary, try to expand the judiciary or fire all the members of the court. Often what's actually taking place is an effort by an executive to increase their control of the political system and to reduce the possibility for genuine contestation or competition. or if you redraw election districts in a way that reduces competition and makes it easier for the incumbent to win, that's anti-democratic. And this is one of the things that Viktor Orban in Hungary is often held up as the model of this form of politics. One of the first things he did when he came into power was impose a retirement age, change the way that judges are elected, so he'd get the referees on his side. And you think of an analogy of a football game.
Yeah.
Then the next thing he did was he rewrote the electoral boundaries, and he essentially tilted the playing field against the opposition. And then third thing he did is he went after the opposition players, media, universities, and so on. And the purpose of all of this in the end was to, in effect, make competition and contestation against the leader much more difficult.
So maybe I'm going to put the last two questions together in the interests of time. When we talk about the world being increasingly bipolar when it comes to political, in the political sphere, we could pick the United States and China being part of that ecosystem. What does the future of democracy look like to you? And will it be confined only to part of the globe and be affected by the countries and economies that have a closer relationship with either the US or either China?
Well, looking at the last 10 years of data, the democracy is in fact growing in a lot of unusual and surprising places. And has remained resilient. And it's not always, it's not simply wealth, it's not simply size, and so on. So democracy can thrive in unlikely circumstances. It is true that foreign policy of major powers plays an important role.
Mm-hmm.
We know this in the history of Portugal, for instance. The role of the U.S. and other countries. Big powers have had an impact on what happened in 1974 in Portugal. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in democracies around the world today, what's so distinctive about the current moment, what's different from, let's say, 1995, 1996, is in 1995, 1996, it was a kind of unipolar moment where the EU and the US were committed to expanding democracy, and there was no opposition to that globally. Today, Russia is much more assertive. China is much more impactful. And so there is an alternative model on offer. And so, you see this in Chinese foreign policy in different regions of the world, and interventions for economic reasons in Africa. And so this means that there's sort of competing models on offer. And I think democracies have to perform and be able to deliver for citizens. And I think ultimately then this will determine how democracy fares in other parts of the world. And so that's why it's so important that in Western Europe and the United States, the democracy work, because if it fails there, then the model disappears for the rest of the world.
Exactly. Crucial point. So we're getting to the quick fire. 4 questions in one word or in one sentence. If you could please answer these. I know they could take a lot longer. Yeah. But the first one is, what personality trait, according to your experience, do you think that a good leader could benefit from having?
Charisma and the ability to compromise.
Okay. What is the biggest challenge for humanity in our lifetime?
Climate change.
A lot of people pick that one. If you could change one thing in the world today by magic, what would that be?
Oh boy. A rapid energy transformation that suddenly overnight we're all relying on solar panels.
Yeah. Very, very good one. And finally, what do you consider to be the most important learning of your life and career?
The most important learning. So
learning of your life and career.
You mean that I've learned from others?
That you have learned from life and from your career. What is one thing, at the end of your life that the most important thing you'll kind of take with you?
I think that at the end of the day, it's individual morality and courage that matter the most.
Okay. Very good one. Daniel, it's been an absolute pleasure to have an opportunity to speak with you. You've definitely shed a lot of light, I think, not only for me, but more importantly for our viewers and listeners on this tremendously important subject. Continued success in your endeavors and in trying to, not just educate, but inspire others to know more about this the system of government, which is so important to allow to give people a voice in whatever nation or territory they're living in.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. An absolute pleasure to discuss democracy, how democracies die, how democracy can survive in the future with Daniel Ziblatt. That brings another episode of It's Not That Simple to a close. See you soon.